production center 2 years later with the same line, they would have said, "Don't worry, son, we'll make a man of you." And they wouldn't even have let me back out the building. And I went home and bought a bus ticket to Toronto. But I don't like to take too much credit for that having been a political act in the sense that political acts are sometimes understood. It had much more. It had much more to do with my wanting to be with hippie girls and have lots of hashish than it did with my sympathy for the plight of the North Vietnamese people under U.S. imperialism. Much more to do with hippie girls than hashish. Consequently, when I got to Toronto, I actually, to my, I think, chagrin somewhat, I found that I really, really couldn't handle hanging out with the American draft dodgers. There was too much clinical depression. There was too much suicide. There was too much hardcore substance abuse. They were a traumatized lot, those boys. And I just felt like I felt frivolous. Toronto's Summer of Love was up there with San Francisco's, I would imagine. It was really quite a party. Sort of an alternative mode of perception. Most of the people, I suppose really everyone that I counted as a close friend, seemed to harbor the unspoken assumption that everything that had gone before us was ending. It was really a very millennial time, far more millennial than this last year of the century.
What did you think was ending?
The straight world. I think that's what I would have told you at the time. But the straight world didn't end. The straight world and the other world bled into one another and produced the world that we live in today. Drugs were absolutely central to that experience, but they weren't essential. They weren't actually essential to it. I only know that in retrospect. At the time, I'm sure I would have said that they were, ingesting the right chemical was absolutely essential to the experience, but in retrospect, no. It was simply a matter of being there and being somewhat open to possibilities. What you couldn't have told me at that stage in my life, what I couldn't have told me at that stage in my life that I've subsequently come to accept, is that all any drug amounts to is tweaking the incoming data. And you have to be really incredibly self-centered or pathetic to be satisfied with simply tweaking the incoming data. Enough of the right drug and anything is groovy. Enough of the right drug and it's okay to be having open heart surgery. Well, who wants that? My experience has been that beyond a certain point, there's only pathology. You're not dealing with a personality anymore. You're dealing with a kind of hardwired pathology. You're dealing with a chemical entity, a neurochemical entity. It doesn't really have much to do with who the person it's manifesting in was. Recreational drugs are essentially a wank, and a wank is okay, but you really should know that it's just a wank. And I think that's what we didn't know, to use the generational we, and what some of us still don't know. I was kept from the opiates by having read Burroughs. I knew from even before I'd ever tried any mind-altering substances, that heroin was really addictive, and that you thought it wasn't when you began to take it, but then you discovered that it was. You know, the opiates aside, I tried whatever was going. You know, I sort of prided myself on it. In fact, I was sort of a very regular cannabis user for a number of years, in spite of the fact that I always had a terrible time with it. And, you know, I've long since come to realize that I suffer from cannabis dysphoria, like the lowest possible dose of cannabinol makes me incredibly uncomfortable and unhappy. I think it's just easier to die doing that stuff than people are comfortable admitting. You know, at least people who like to do that stuff. A certain number of people do their accustomed dose of cocaine, or sometimes even their very first dose of cocaine, and simply drop dead. You know, a certain percentage of people do. It's kind of like, you know, the street drug thing is when did you ever hear a drug dealer, when did you ever go to a drug dealer and the drug dealer says, you know, you should come back tomorrow, this is not very pure. Yeah, it's not too good tonight, come next week. It doesn't happen.
Where are we?
This is Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. The closest thing to a city near where my parents were living in a beach house when I was born in 1948. This was a farm that my parents had rented, I believe, while my father's construction company put in a lot of the civilian sort of workaday plumbing around the Oak Ridge Atomic Project. My father was working there during the production of the bombs, I believe. Army Jeep of some kind. This is in Virginia Beach or nearby, which is where I lived just prior to my father's death in 56. Upon his death, within a matter of days, my mother had packed everything up and taken me back to Withville, which was the town both my parents came from in southwest Virginia. She stayed there for the rest of her life. My mother's death when I was 19 coincided with the beginning of what we think of as the 60s. I was in a boarding school in Tucson, Arizona, and we would see the people coming and going from San Francisco. You know, you couldn't miss them, really. There had never been people in America who looked like that, and they looked like they were having a pretty good time. So, you know, I knew already that something was going on. No one had given it a name yet. What was going on inside me and what was going on in the world outside were very, very confused for me. I had no way of sorting those things out. You know, it just seemed like the inside of my head was going off and the outside was going off as well. I know I became very, very isolated for a long time. I mean, I really do think, I mean, maybe it's just a middle-aged thing, but I'm inclined to think that I was crazy at some level for a long time. But it's only become apparent to me relatively late in life, and it's only become apparent because I no longer feel that I am crazy.
What makes you anxious these days?